Aerial bombing, 1914 to 1915, crossing the Rubicon with baby steps. I'm going to start before the war, since we're going to do a history of aerial bombing in the first year and a half of the war. I'm going to start before the war. In 1899, there was a Hague Convention that worked on creating rules for warfare. Most of them related to ground wars and naval wars, but there was one small section that referred to the potential for war in the air. In 1899, they prohibited for 5 years the dropping of projectiles or explosives from balloons or other airships. This Hague Convention was not ratified by either the United Kingdom or the U.S., although it probably had nothing to do with the aviation provision, since it was only a small part of it. This gives us a picture of what pre-war attitudes were regarding aerial bombing. It was viewed as something that should not be done by any country. This was renewed after negotiations in 1907. They extended this prohibition against aerial bombing, but among the major powers in the world, it was only ratified by China, the UK, and the US in 1907. When we move into the First World War, we will start to get aircraft dropping bombs on civilians, on cities, on open cities, as they call them, undefended cities. A lot of countries that didn't ratify the prohibition nevertheless screamed about the violation of it. But the point is, we're seeing what the world thought about the possibility of the aerial bombing of civilians in 1899, 1907. Another little-known footnote in aviation history is an attack that happened in Mazatlan, a port city on the western coast of Mexico, in May 1914, just before World War I began. In that attack, a constitutionalist airplane, flown by a mercenary, accidentally bombed civilians while attacking a fort held by the Federalists. There were 5 civilians killed and 16 wounded. Mexico, being a small power, was often plagued by the larger powers in the world. As it turned out, both the United States and Germany had naval warships in the Mazatlan port. The commanders of those protested, and ultimately the constitutionalist general apologized for this inadvertent attack on civilians, and he worked with his adversary to establish a neutral zone for the protection of civilians. Again, the idea of dropping bombs on civilians before World War I absolutely horrified people. We move ahead almost 30 years to the firebombing of Hamburg in the summer of 1943. RAF's Bomber Command and the U.S. Army Air Force conducted firebombings of Hamburg, resulting in 45,000 deaths and 37,000 wounded. Whenever you've got some kind of attack that ends up with more people being killed than wounded, you know it's particularly horrific, because it's the absolute opposite of what you normally see. So the question is, how did we get to this point from before August 1914 to what we were seeing in August 1943? That's one of the main themes of this presentation. How did we cross the Rubicon from pre-war attitudes towards bombing of civilians to what happened in World War II? Other themes that we're going to be looking at in the process of this talk are the immaturity of the technology that was used in 1914 and 1915. These are the baby steps that I allude to in the title. The experimental nature of bombing aviation in World War I, not only equipment, but in tactics. They were starting from zero. They had to innovate a lot in order to accomplish anything. We're also going to look at the evolution in most of the countries very quickly from general purpose aviation in their squadrons to more specialized units that focused on one particular task for a squadron. Finally, we're going to look at the role of naval aviation in bombing development. If this were a drinking game, you would take a drink every time I say the word naval. All right? Okay, those are the themes that we're going to talk about. We're going to go through this area by area, and we're going to talk about German bombing by both Zeppelins and airplanes. And we're going to talk about aerial bombing by the French, British, Russians, and Italians. Finally, we'll conclude by looking at the bombing that was conducted on all sides in the Gallipoli campaign. Why is that doing that? That's better. Okay. All right. The Germans crossed the Rubicon very quickly. In August 1914, the German Army Zeppelin, the Z9, attacked Antwerp during the siege of Belgium, when Belgium was surrounded, the siege of Antwerp, when Antwerp was being besieged by the German army. They dropped 10 small bombs on Antwerp. They killed 10 civilians and wounded a number of others. The picture is from that first bombing, and I put in an arrow showing you where the bomb damage is, because it's so tiny that you really need an arrow to be able to see it. It destroyed the second floor of this building and didn't destroy the first floor of it, nor did it destroy the other townhouses that were right next to it. This was a very small result from a very small bomb, 1 of 10. There were 2 women who were living there who were wounded, but nobody was killed from that particular bomb. After this bomb raid, Antwerp was bombed 2 other times by the Germans.
All 3 times with the Zeppelin?
All 3 times with the Zeppelin, yes, yes. This attack absolutely horrified the world. This was covered in the press all over the place. It was covered extensively in the press in the United States. The Germans, however, were absolutely tone deaf to propaganda. And so they actually had German postcard manufacturers making postcards celebrating this thing that was viewed as an atrocity by the rest of the world. Similarly, in 1915, they also struck a medal to commemorate the sinking of the Lusitania, which the British got great propaganda value out of. Now, even though only 10 people were killed, as it appeared in the press, a lot of the details of those 10 unfortunate people were pretty shocking. 2 of the people were a married couple. One of the other people who was killed in this bomb raid was decapitated by the bomb. You can imagine how that looked in the press in Europe and the United States. And there's a picture of the Zeppelin Z9. We're going to come back to that Zeppelin later on when we get to Royal Naval Air Service attacks on Zeppelins. the bombing of Antwerp, just a few days into the beginning of the war, was a case of crossing the Rubicon. The Germans did a similar thing with the bombing of England, which started in 1915, only 19 days into the New Year's. They attacked England on that first Zeppelin raid with 2 naval airships, L3 and L4. Again, the casualties were not very high. 4 people killed, 16 injured. But as the year went on, however, they really did mount. In 1915 in all, they conducted 20 raids, 39 sorties by Zeppelins. 208 British people, almost all of them civilians, were killed, 522 were wounded. The first Zeppelin raid on London took place on the last night of May 1915. I've actually walked the route of that raid and took a picture of the first building in London ever hit by a bomb. This house here was hit by the incendiary bomb that's shown in the inset. The family was able to get out. The husband bicycled to the local fire brigade, and they came and put out the fire. So the building still stands. At the time I was there was no historical marker indicating that this was the first building in London hit by an aerial bomb. My understanding is that with a commemoration of the centennial, that there is a historical marker there now. The Germans also conducted airship raids on the Eastern Front. This is not very well known. The only decent source I could find on this was an article published by the late Augie Bloom in Over the Front in the summer of 1998. It turned out that both the German Army and Navy, which both had Zeppelins, rotated various Zeppelins in and out of the Eastern Front for the purposes of reconnaissance and bombing. In any one month, they had 2 to 8 Zeppelins in place for use there. Primarily, they targeted the rail networks on the Eastern Front, and the rail networks were probably the most common target for aerial bombing in the First World War. They also attacked troop concentrations and depots. In an indication of the immaturity of the technology, one of the themes that I've listed initially, at least 12 of these airships were lost to weather, ground fire, and accidents. The postcard, a period postcard in color, shows the bombing of Warsaw by a German Zeppelin. I wanted to get an idea of how, kind of, what were they attacking and how far was it? So I put together this map. I used the map that was published in Over the Front by Augie Bloom, and I blocked out in yellow the airship bases that they flew from, and then in blue are marked the various cities that they attacked. These are places like Warsaw was attacked, Vilnius, Brest-Litovsk, a fair number of important cities in the area of what is now Poland and the Baltic states. Warsaw had the distinction of being both a target and an airship base. After it was taken over by the German Army in mid-1915, they started using Warsaw as an airship base also. I put in the distance of 100 miles so you can get an idea of the range that they were flying. Pretty impressive for 1914. So that summarizes German airship bombing. I'm moving on to German airplane bombing. Once the warfare on the Western Front settled down into trench warfare after the First Battle of the Marne it really created a lot of opportunities for airplane bombing. Because you didn't need to worry about, you know, if you see something, if you see a very nice target down below, you can be pretty certain you know whether it's your side or whether it's the other side, because everything is static. You don't have to wonder, you know, is that convoy of cavalry down there, are they French or are they German? You generally would know. So that made a lot of opportunities for aerial bombing. The German High Command created a dedicated bombing group in December 1914 under just their command. Unlike other aviation units, it was not under the command of a particular army. It was under the command of the German High Command. And this is part of our theme of moving from general aviation units to more specialized units. It was given the cover name of the Ostend Carrier Pigeon Section. I've been studying German for over a year, and so now I'll finally get to use it. It had the German initials BAO for Brieftaubenabteilung Ostenda. Thank you, Frau Linderman, wherever you are. Their intention was to bomb England from Calais. Once the German army moved into Calais and took it over, they knew that they could reach England with airplanes. This never happened, at least not in World War I. And so they had to take this bombing unit, the BAO, and they used it for other missions. They used it for more tactical purposes, and they ended up moving it around. They flew it from Ostend, from Metz, and from the Russian and Galician fronts. They actually had the air crew based on a train, so that they could easily move them from one front to another, or at night they could just move the train to some siding someplace and black it out so it couldn't be reached by either Allied artillery or Allied airplanes. Practically all of the information that I was able to find on this is in Peter Kilduff's Germany's First Air Force, which is really a very good source for, I shouldn't say for obscure stuff, but it is. The very first aircraft they had were a conglomeration of B-type aircraft. Two-seaters, pilot in the back, observer in the front, and they could carry about 8 small bombs each.
What's a small bomb?
A small bomb is 2 kilograms, 5 kilograms, probably not 10. And they would be dropping them through this little cage here from where the observer sat in front, through the cage, and hopefully avoiding the wing and then down.
Interesting.
All right. As I say, this was very makeshift. So they used B-type planes, Albatros, Aviatique, LVG, and Otto for this. Just a real mixed bag of airplanes. They typically targeted, as you can see, troops, convoys, railroad stations, ports, depots. They also flew Sperrflüge, which were barrage flights. This was an early idea that was used or misused by both the Germans and the French. They thought that the way to protect something from bombers is to fly other bombers on patrol, fly their own bombers on patrol, kind of like a sentry walking back and forth. And so a lot of bombing units early in the war, certainly both French and German, ended up doing that. It was never very useful, because if you want to catch a bomber, you should fly something faster, like a fighter, to catch it. I want you to remember the photo, because in two more slides we're going to talk about the bombing of Paris, and the bombing of Paris was also conducted by an LVG B-1. Later developments, this history does go up through the end of 1915. They got better aircraft, Albatross C-1 aircraft, which had the observer in the back. Big innovation. Planes that were designed for bombing, like the AEG-G2. And then finally, they improved even more their administrative structure, taking the BAO and a similar unit that was based out of Metz and making them the first two Kagols, which were bombing Geschwaders, essentially, bomber wings. The Ostend Carrier Pigeon section started with 31 pilots and 13 observers, which by 1915 standards is actually a pretty large unit. The Germans also bombed Paris, again in the first month of the war, 30th of August 1914. An LVG-B1 commanded by Lieutenant von Hidesen dropped 5 tiny bombs. When I say tiny bombs, I'm talking about something about the size of grenades or a little bigger, near the Gare de l'Est, the main French rail station to the east of Paris. The bombs landed within walking distance of it, and I went to the alley, which is now the street that was the first place in Paris that was ever hit by an aerial bomb. There is no longer any marker there indicating what it was. But again, you've got tiny bomb load and a small number of people killed and wounded. But again, the Germans had crossed the Rubicon early in August. I'm going to move on now to French bombing. The picture I have here is a painting by Henri Faré, French Impressionist painter. This is an image that the National Air and Space Museum was kind enough to let me use. Thank you, Carl. And it shows an air raid on the 6th of September 1915. It seems like 2016 is going to be a good year for the French Impressionist painter Henri Faré, because there's going to be an article about him in Over the Front. I'm not sure who the author is. Do you remember, Mike?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'll come up with it.
All right. And there is also going to be an article about Faré in the magazine of the World War I Historical Association called World War I, written by David Beer, and I helped him with the images. So there's going to be a lot written about Faré in the next year. So very early on in French bombing, they weren't really doing bombing in earnest. Planes did reconnaissance. That was the important work that they did. And so the air crews would drop flechettes, steel darts, or modified artillery shells during reconnaissance missions. If they saw something that looked like it'd be nice to drop something on, then they would do that. But there was really no planning behind it. Early on, however, they took 2 of the Voisin squadrons and made them bombing units, end of September 1914. Again, moving from generalized to specialized units early on.
Any comment on why there's this star on there?
Yes, the star was the color of this was, actually, let me go down one more line. The first bombardment group was created at the end of November with 3 escadrilles of Voisins under Commandant Degois. And the 3 different escadrilles in the first bombardment group had different color stars on the side of their plane as a squadron marking. One was blue, one was red, and I don't know.
VB1 was blue, VB3 was red, and VB2 was, I think it's, they went for an oblique cross of Lorraine in blue.
Okay.
And
Right.
later they were redesignated VB 101, 102, and 103. And that red starred unit, VB 103, would later become a fighter unit.
Mhm.
The one
Yes.
Rene Funk was part of. And well, even after they adopted Storks, the upper wing often retained that red star in deference to their original emblem.
Mhm.
So what you're looking at is a voisin from VB1 there. I mean VB3.
Okay.
And the next, that same issue of Over the Front will have a history of Escadrille VB2 through SPA 102.
Ah, okay.
John, is that the one with the FARA article? Is that what you-
Yep, Faray visited them and he painted an incident in that unit's history, which will appear in there, I believe.
Well, Steve, that the FARA article is by Peter Tola.
Oh, great, okay, good. Okay. 1915, for French bombing, in the words of René Martel, was the brilliant but fleeting rise of daylight bombing. It was kind of a golden age for French bombing. They far exceeded expectations in terms of what they were able to bomb, the distances they were able to bomb, the results they obtained, and it was really great because essentially they had no fighter opposition. By the end of 1915, however, these pusher bombers were in real deep trouble because of the Fokker Eindecker and Aviation two-seaters, which could knock them down with relative ease. So beyond that, into 1916, they transitioned to night bombing because their airplanes simply couldn't survive on long bombing missions during the day. Talking about the experimental nature of bombing in World War I, it helps to think about what they didn't have and what they had to create. At the beginning of the war, they did not have bomb racks, bomb sites, airplane-mounted machine guns. They had no tactics or methods for aiming bombs, dropping them, navigating, or flying in formation. All of these things had to be created from scratch.
Other than
The first bombardment group in the French Air Force was the incubator for all the new equipment and methods. They were there the longest. They did all the experimentations. They did actually have real bomb racks, so they didn't have to just throw it out the side, throw bombs out the side. In early March 1915, and they created 3 more bombardment groups by the end of March. They also created the interesting tool of target dossiers, which you don't think of when you think of airplanes dropping bombs. You think about bomb racks and bomb sites. They put together as much information as they had on their targets, on the routes to the targets, so they could keep track of where there were good flak batteries and where there were German airfields. And so they put together things, including with aerial photographs, so they knew what their target looked like and where they wanted to hit it. A real important early innovation in aerial bombing created by the French. Some of these large raids, again, we're looking at a Voisin 3. These pictures I took at the Air and Space Museum at Le Bourget Airport. They attacked Ludwigshafen, about 100 miles away from Nancy, the poison gas factories. They attacked Ludwigshafen and Mannheim, and actually created a leakage of poison gas in the city of Mannheim from their raid. They also hit oil refineries at Petrobran. They did a reprisal raid at Karlsruhe in reprisal for the German shelling the city of Verdun and for the German Zeppelin raids on England. They also struck the German iron and steel industry in the Saar River Valley. So they had a number of very successful long-range raids in 1915. The ones that are shown here were conducted from May to September 1915. And then, as I said initially, after that the party was over. The German fighters got to be too effective for them to continue. Okay, we're going to move on now to British bombing, and we're going to look specifically at Royal Naval Air Service raids on Zeppelin sheds. These were absolutely amazing raids conducted in 1914 with very primitive aircraft. They attacked Zeppelin sheds in Dusseldorf, Cologne, Friedrichshafen, and Cuxhaven. I'll show you a map on the next slide. The raid on Dusseldorf destroyed the German Zeppelin Z9 that we talked about earlier. And this painting is I took a photograph of a painting in the Royal Air Force Museum of Reginald Merrick's successfully bombing that Zeppelin. Okay, here's the marker for 100 miles. You've got raids from Antwerp before it fell to the German army. Beg pardon?
Never mind, I found it.
Okay, yeah, you've got raids in Antwerp before it fell to the German army. They attacked Dusseldorf, destroyed a Zeppelin there, attacked a Zeppelin shed in Cologne without results. Again, these are close to 100 miles away, flying Avro 504s. It's just astounding. Down in Belfort, flying Avro 504s, down here next to the Swiss border, they sort of cut across Swiss territory and attacked Zeppelin sheds at Friedrichshafen, which is where the Zeppelins were manufactured. There's still a Zeppelin museum in Friedrichshafen. It's very nice. And then finally, at the end of 1914, they conducted the first carrier-based air attack. They were based in the North Sea, and they went looking for the Zeppelin shed at Cuxhaven. Ultimately, they did not find it, but this was nevertheless a historic raid. And these are, I mean, it's just all the way up and down the Western Front, and flights at great distances with really primitive aircraft. This is just amazing stuff. There's a book on this called The Zeppelin Base Raids, Osprey, I think, and it really describes these very well. Okay, that's the Royal Naval Air Service. Again, a naval air service is really taking a lead in developing aerial bombing in World War I. I'm going to look briefly at the Royal Flying Corps, the Army's unit. They did a very interesting thing. The Royal Flying Corps headquarters did a study in July 1915 where they took an objective look at all of the cases where they had bombed German rail stations, trying to upset German offensives. They found that they were successful 3 times out of 141 raids. So what they did was very smart. They changed their air raids from attacks on rail stations to attacks on trains, against trains. So what does that do? So if you attack a rail station with a bomber with small bombs, you're going to maybe knock out a little bit of track, put a hole in the track bed, and it's easily fixed in a matter of hours by the crews in the rail station. However, if you can set fire to a train sitting on a track and have it burn there, it's going to stay there until they can move it. And so you tie up the lines a lot longer. So they changed to not attacking rail stations but attacking trains. To get the maximum use out of the few aircraft they had available, they made joint attacks with the French. And they only hit the rail network during major offensives, when it really was going to make a difference, to try to maximize what they were doing. The first time they tried this was in the Battle of Loos in September 1915. And I wish I could tell you how successful it was, but the British official history doesn't seem to mention that. The interesting thing is, they make this strategy change in July 1915. In November and December 1918, after the war is over, and then early into 1919, the U.S. Air Service made a bombing survey in the occupied Rhineland, where they went around and they talked to factory officials and rail officials and other people, mayors, to determine the effectiveness of aerial bombing in the Rhineland during World War I. They found that the British had gone back to bombing rail stations, and that the Germans had crews available at every rail station, and they could fix the problem within just a few hours, no matter how much damage they had done in the rail station. So for some reason, they went back to the old tactics that didn't work for the rest of the war, and I couldn't tell you why. Okay, one more slide on the Royal Flying Corps. During this time, they developed the Central Flying School bomb sight, which was used with a stopwatch. It was a reasonably good bomb sight. They came up with this by mid-1915, and both they and the Royal Naval Air Service used it successfully for another year and a half or longer. Other air forces also created bomb sites, the French, the Germans, but this is one I have a nice picture of. Okay, we're going to talk now about Russian bombing, the Ilya-Muromets. In 1913, Igor Sikorsky built a 4-engine passenger plane. It was the largest plane in the world, and it continued to be the world's largest plane through at least 1915. And I don't know how long it held that record. Certainly the Germans were trying to build giant bombers by the end of 1916. But for a while, the Russians had the world's largest airplane. It was first used operationally in late February 1915. And during 1915, which is the period we're studying, they used up to about 9 of them at any one time. They're ramping up their production as time goes on, and they had more and more of them in 1916, but that's out of the scope of this talk. Most of their missions were really reconnaissance missions, with any bombing that was decided kind of ad hoc by the airplane commander. They also, because it was a reconnaissance mission with excellent aerial photography, they also used the aerial photographs for bomb damage assessment, something which is still being done. And this was a very advanced technique. I mean, this is amazing. They're doing this in 1915. Finally, I read the accounts, the first-hand accounts of what the Russian bombing was accomplishing, and somehow it seems incredibly accurate. And I'm just wondering, how believable is this? I mean, it seems like they decide they're going to bomb something like, you know, a rail yard full of trains, and so they fly along and they get it in their sights, and they hit it the first time. And it seems like time and time again they hit things on their first time. Then they'll go back for another pass with their second and last bomb, and they'll hit it again, which seems incredibly accurate for World War I bombing. I don't know if they're pulling our leg or trying to fool their big commanders, but it seems very accurate if you can take what they say at face value. The Russians also created the EVK, the Squadron of Flying Ships. Again, they're doing this sophisticated thing. This is one more Air Force doing a sophisticated thing of creating a specialized unit as opposed to general units doing any which task which comes up. They've created these fairly early. Their primary target, as with so much of World War I bombing, is the rail network. They also attacked airfields, artillery, especially anti-aircraft artillery. They hated anti-aircraft artillery. And so they frequently saved their bombs for those. They also hit wagon trains and German mobile bakeries and troops. The color postcard here is a World War I era color postcard of a German mobile bakery. Their missions were often in excess of 4 hours of flight, which is pretty amazing for 1915. And their typical bomb load was just over 1/4 of a ton. Moving on to the Italians. The first Italian Caproni bomber that was used had 3 100 horsepower engines. And they conducted their first bombing mission on the 20th of August, 1915. Remember, the Italians didn't enter the war until May 1915. They had two Capronis attacked an Austro-Hungarian airfield with 35 bombs.
I see, I think, 2 propellers.
It went to pusher in the back.
Oh,
Yeah.
there's another one back there.
Yes, there's,
Thank you.
yeah, 3 engines, 3 propellers. They continued making more and more advanced versions of this with better engines, higher horsepower, through World War I and even beyond. By the end of the year, 1915, they had a dozen Capronis flying in 3 squadrons. Attacking Austro-Hungarian airfields and rail stations and road traffic, with those squadrons. Again, they've created advanced, specialized units just for bombing. Okay, the last topic we're going to look at is Gallipoli. Gallipoli isn't as well known as the Western Front, and so I'm going to take a slide and talk about what the strategic objectives were in Gallipoli, and talk about the order of battle and who was bombing what in the Gallipoli campaign, because this is not that well known. When the Ottoman Empire entered the war in, I think it was November 1914, the route for most of Russia's trade suddenly became blocked. Most Russian trade came into the Black Sea, went through the Bosphorus Straits by Istanbul, went down to the Dardanelles, into the Aegean and the Mediterranean Sea. That was no longer available to either the Allies trying to supply Russia or to the Russians trying to get munitions, grain, anything they needed. So this was a very serious problem strategically. On the 18th of March, 1915, a joint French and British naval fleet attempted to force the Dardanelles to come up here to do battle with the forts on both sides, protecting the Dardanelles. Their hope was to get past them, up and shell Istanbul into submission, force them to withdraw from the war. It was a miserable failure. They lost several capital ships, both British and French. It was a disaster. And so they came back at the end of April to invade the Gallipoli Peninsula in here. They had landings right down here on the tip and other landings up through here. This bogged down horribly because the Turkish army was so good, and amphibious landings are hard to do. This bogged down completely. They finally evacuated the Gallipoli Peninsula pretty successfully at the end of 1915 and into January 1916. Aerial bombing was used to interdict Turkish resupply of troops, or on the part of the Central Powers, it was used to help the resupply of troops. And you'll see more what I mean as we move on. The order of battle. What were the assets? Oh, one more point before I move on to that. I'm going to talk about the bombing. The bombing and the air fighting, however, air-to-air combat, were much less important than the real critical job of aviation in the Gallipoli campaign. The real critical job of aviation was helping the British and French navies sight their guns so that they could assist in the battle, providing massive artillery for the Battle of Gallipoli. That was the most important thing aviation did. The bombing part of it, which is the part I'm going to talk about, was of less importance. Air-to-air combat was of even less importance. Okay, the order of battle. The British had two wings of the Royal Naval Air Service based on the islands of Imbros and Tenedos. They were a mixed bag of BE-2s, Wazons, Newport 10s, Newport 12s. Okay, these are not really capable airplanes. They also had, in the Aegean Sea, first one, the Ark Royal, and then another, the Ben My Chree, transporters for seaplanes. So they had land-based naval aircraft on the islands, and they had float planes. I know we talked about that earlier, so I got to get it right. We had float planes that were based at sea also. The French had one escadrille. They were also on the island of Tenedos. Escadrille MF-98T for Tenedos. They were flying 9 Maurice Farman MF-11s. As you may have heard me say before regarding the MF-11, remember it had 2/3 of the horsepower of a Mini Cooper. And they're trying to use that as a bomber. Okay, the Germans had seaplanes here. They had Gotha WD-1 and WD-2 seaplanes, about 10 to 15 of them. And they were initially based at Çanakkale. All French, British, and American maps refer to this town, which is at the narrows of the Dardanelles, as Chanak. I don't know why. It has always been Çanakkale. But for some reason they cut off the last 4 letters of the name. They were based at Çanakkale. And I have a question mark here by Turkish Naval Aviation. I know for certain that the Turkish Navy was flying float planes in this area in 1916. I have not been able to find a source that definitively tells me whether they were flying alongside the Germans in 1915 during the time that the Gallipoli battle was going on. So they may have also been flying their own Gotha WD-1 and WD-2 float planes. Later on, they moved their aviation assets up to Radesto so they could interdict, so they could fly them into the Sea of Marmara here. The Allied bombing targets, I'm going to start here and move counterclockwise. For all of these aircraft, all of the Allied aircraft, either based on the islands or based at sea, they were directly attacking Turkish troops, bivouacs, convoys, and so on the Gallipoli Peninsula itself that were holding down the British and French troops. They also attacked the seaplane base and the port at Çanakkale. Çanakkale is a nice little town. I stayed there when I was doing the Gallipoli tour. It's a really pretty little town, very nice. They also have a naval aviation museum, a naval museum, which includes some stuff on aviation. They attacked the coal depot at Nogara, the flour mills at Gallipoli town that were supplying the troops, the Turkish troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula. There were also ships convoying ammunition, food, troops, etc. down the Sea of Marmara. They were attacking those. And you have road and rail transport by land going down, also supplying the Turks on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The British and French were attacking those also. Finally, late in the war, Bulgaria entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. And suddenly you had a complete link between Germany in the north and Turkey in the south. And so they were trying to interdict the rail lines at the bridge at Ferengic here, trying to interdict that with their bombers. At no time did the Allies, French and British, have more than 60 aircraft in theater. This is a small campaign. The late Dick Lehman, who wrote on this extensively and wrote probably one of the best books on naval aviation, World War I ever. Dick Lehman wrote in, I'm not sure which year, Over the Front, Volume 9 anyway. He wrote that bombing the Turkish resupply could have affected the Battle of Gallipoli, but the number of planes and the performance they had were inadequate. The German bombing targets, they had their float planes first at Çanakkale, and then later they had some up here too. They were attacking the Allied ships, they were attacking the Allied airfields on the two islands, and they were also attacking British submarines in the Sea of Marmara that were going after Turkish shipping. So the British had successfully sent several submarines submerged up through the Dardanelles, past all the minefields, and they were operating with pretty much impunity in the Sea of Marmara against Turkish shipping. The Turks, the British and maybe the Turks were striking at those submarines where they could. This is a picture of 1916 picture of one of the Turkish Gota WD-1 or 2s, and this is interesting because Turkish naval aviation had one of the first black pilots in the world, Ahmet Ali. Okay, I'm going to conclude with this photograph from summer 1996 issue of Over the Front. It shows a bunch of Turkish soldiers, kind of as tourists, standing around an Allied 9.2-inch artillery piece. And the caption that was in Over the Front said that the Turkish caption down here said that it was a British artillery piece, but the author said that couldn't have been British because they didn't use 9.2 guns, and so we didn't know where this thing came from. But anyway, you've got tourists standing around this gun. Tourists stand around this gun still. And the gun is French, from Le Havre. I know because I've sat on it. All right, I'll take your question.